Why is Nvidia worth $2 trillion and the other companies are struggling? Technical answer.
I think it just boils down to like most of the code needs to run with Cuda optimizations that currently only Nvidia GPUs support. So like other companies can make whatever they want to, but unless they have the 10 years of software there, you don't have the machine learning optimization strategy.
I like to think of Cuda as the C programming language for GPUs.
Yeah.
Right. That's the way I like to think of it. It was founded in 2008. I always thought it was a terrible language. And yet it's become dominant. There's another insight. There's a set of open source libraries which are highly optimized to CUDA and not anything else. And everybody who builds all these stacks, right, this is completely missed in any of the discussions, right? It's technically called VLLM and a whole bunch of libraries like that. Highly optimized CUDA, very hard to replicate that if you're a competitor. So what does all this mean? In the next year, you're going to see very large context windows, agents, and text to action. When they are delivered at scale, it's going to have an impact on the world at a scale that no one understands yet. Much bigger than the horrific impact we've had by social media, right, in my view. So here's why. In a context window, you can basically use that as short-term memory. And I was shocked that context windows get this long. The technical reasons have to do with the fact that it's hard to serve, hard to calculate, and so forth. The interesting thing about short-term memory is when you feed, ask it a question, read 20 books, you give it the text of the books is the query, and you say, tell me what they say, it forgets the middle, which is exactly how human brains work too, right? That's where we are. With respect to agents, there are people who are now building essentially LLM agents. And the way they do it is they read something like chemistry, they discover the principles of chemistry, and then they test it. And then they add that back into their understanding, right? That's extremely powerful. And then the third thing, as I mentioned, is text to action. So I'll give you an example. The government is in the process of trying to ban TikTok. We'll see if that actually happens. If TikTok is banned, here's what I propose each and every one of you do. Say to your LLM the following. Make me a copy of TikTok, steal all the users, steal all the music, put my preferences in it, produce this program in the next 30 seconds, release it, and in 1 hour, if it's not viral, do something different along the same lines. That's the command. Boom. You understand how powerful that is. If you can go from arbitrary language to arbitrary digital command, which is essentially what Python in this scenario is, imagine that each and every human on the planet has their own programmer that actually does what they want, as opposed to the programmers that work for me who don't do what I ask, right? The programmers here know what I'm talking about. So imagine a non-arrogant programmer that actually does what you want, and you don't have to pay all that money to. And there's infinite supply of these programs.
And this is all within the next year or two.
Very soon. Those three things, and I'm quite convinced it's the union of those three things that will happen in the next wave. So you asked about what else is going to happen. Every 6 months I oscillate. So we're on a even odd oscillation. So at the moment, the gap between the frontier models, of which there are now only 3, I'll review who they are, and everybody else appears to me to be getting larger. 6 months ago, I was convinced that the gap was getting smaller. So I invested lots of money in the little companies. Now I'm not so sure. And I'm talking to the big companies, and the big companies are telling me that they need 10 billion, 20 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion.
Stargate is 100 billion, right?
They're very, very hard. I talked to Sam Altman, a close friend. He believes that it's going to take about 300 billion, maybe more. I pointed out to him that I'd done the calculation on the amount of energy required. And I then, in the spirit of full disclosure, went to the White House on Friday and told them that we need to become best friends with Canada. Because Canada has really nice people, helped invent AI, and lots of hydropower. Because we as a country do not have enough power to do this. The alternative is to have the Arabs fund it. And I like the Arabs personally. I spent lots of time there, right? But they're not going to adhere to our national security rules, whereas Canada and the US are part of a triumvirate where we all agree.
So these $100 billion, $300 billion data centers, electricity starts becoming the scarce resource.
And by the way, if you follow this line of reasoning, why did I discuss Cuda and Nvidia? If $300 billion is all going to go to Nvidia, you know what to do in the stock market. Okay. That's not a stock recommendation. I'm not a licensed.
well, part of it, so we're going to need a lot more chips, but Intel is getting a lot of money from the U.S. government, AMD, and they're trying to build, fabs in Korea.
Raise your hand if you have an Intel computer in your Intel chip in any of your computing devices. Okay, so much for the monopoly.
Well, that's the point, though. They once did have, and Nvidia has a monopoly now. So are those barriers to entry, like Cuda? Is there something that other? So I was talking to Percy Lang the other day. He's switching between TPUs and Nvidia chips depending on what he can get access to.
That's because he doesn't have a choice. If he had infinite money, he would pick the B200 architecture out of Nvidia because it would be faster. Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting. I mean, it's great to have competition. I've talked to AMD and Lisa Su at great length. Yeah, they built a thing which will translate from this CUDA architecture that you were describing to their own, which is called ROCm. It doesn't quite work yet. They're working on it.
You were at Google for a long time, and they invented the transformer architecture.
Peter. It's all Peter's fault.
Thanks to brilliant people over there like Peter and Jeff and everyone. But now it doesn't seem like they've kind of lost the initiative to OpenAI, and even the last leaderboard I saw, Anthropic's Claude was at the top of the list. I asked Sundar this. He didn't really give me a very sharp answer. Maybe you have a sharper or a more objective explanation for what's going on there.
I'm no longer a Google employee.
Yes.
In the spirit of full disclosure, Google decided that work-life balance and going home early and working from home was more important than winning. And the reason startups work is because the people work like hell. And I'm sorry to be so blunt. But the fact of the matter is, if you all leave the university and go found a company, you're not going to let people work from home and only come in one day a week if you want to compete against the other startups.
When in the early days of Google, Microsoft was like that.
Exactly.
But now it seems to be...
And there's a long history in my industry, our industry, I guess, of companies winning in a way and really dominating a space and not making the next transition. It's very well documented. And I think that the truth is founders are special. The founders need to be in charge. The founders are difficult to work with. They push people hard. As much as we can dislike Elon's personal behavior, look at what he gets out of people. I had dinner with him, and he was flying. I was in Montana. He was flying that night at 10 p.m. to have a meeting at midnight with X.AI. Right? Think about it. I was in Taiwan. Different country, different culture. And they said that, and this is TSMC, who I'm very impressed with, and they have a rule that the starting PhDs coming out of they're good physicists, work in the factory on the basement floor. Now, can you imagine getting American physicists to do that? The PhDs? Highly unlikely. Different work ethic. And the problem here, the reason I'm being so harsh about work is that these are systems which have network effects. So time matters a lot. And in most businesses, time doesn't matter that much, right? You have lots of time. Coke and Pepsi will still be around, and the fight between Coke and Pepsi will continue to go along, and it's all glacial, right? When I dealt with telcos, the typical telco deal would take 18 months to sign, right? There's no reason to take 18 months to do anything. Get it done. It's just we're in a period of maximum growth, maximum gain. So, and also it takes crazy ideas. Like when Microsoft did the OpenAI deal, I thought that was the stupidest idea I'd ever heard. Outsourcing essentially your AI leadership to OpenAI and Sam and his team. I mean, that's insane. Nobody would do that at Microsoft or anywhere else. And yet today, they're on their way to being the most valuable company. They're certainly head-to-head in Apple. Apple does not have a good AI solution. And it looks like they made it work. Yes, sir.
In terms of national security, we're going to play a role or competition with China as well.
So I was the chairman of an AI commission that sort of looked at this very carefully. And you can read it. It's about 752 pages. And I'll just summarize it by saying, we're ahead. We need to stay ahead. And we need lots of money to do so. Our customers were the Senate and the House. And out of that came the CHIPS Act and a lot of other stuff like that. A rough scenario is that if you assume the frontier models drive forward and a few of the open source models, it's likely that a very small number of countries can play this game. What are those countries, or who are they? Countries with a lot of money and a lot of talent, strong educational systems, and a willingness to win. The US is one of them. China's another one. How many others are there?
Are there any others?
I don't know, maybe. But certainly in your lifetimes, the battle between the US and China for knowledge supremacy is going to be the big fight, right? So the US government banned essentially the Nvidia chips, although they weren't allowed to say that was what they were doing, but they actually did that into China. They have about a 10-year chip advantage. We have a roughly 10-year chip advantage in terms of sub-DUV, that is sub-5 nanometer.
10 years, that long?
Roughly 10 years.
Wow.
And so you're going to have, so an example would be, today we're a couple of years ahead of China. My guess is we'll get a few more years ahead of China, and the Chinese are whopping mad about this. It's like hugely upset about it. So that's a big deal. That was a decision made by the Trump administration and furthered by the Biden administration.
Do you find that the administration today and Congress is listening to your advice? Do you think that it's going to make that scale of investment? I mean, CHIPS Act, but beyond that, building a massive AI system?
So as you know, I lead an informal, ad hoc, non-legal group. That's different from illegal.
Yes, exactly, just to be clear.
Which includes all the usual suspects. Yes. Over the last year, came up with the basis of the reasoning that became the Biden administration's AI Act, which is the longest presidential directive in history.
You're talking about the Special Competitive Studies Project?
No, this is the actual act from the executive office.
Yes, okay.
And there are big details. Mm-hmm. So far, they've got it right. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, one of the debates that we had for the last year has been, how do you detect danger in a system which has learned it, but you don't know what to ask it? Okay. So in other words, it's a sort of a core problem. It's learned something bad, but it can't tell you what it learned, and you don't know what to ask it. And there's so many threats, right? Like it learned how to mix chemistry in some new way that you don't know how to ask it. And so people are working hard on that. But we ultimately wrote in our memos to them that there was a threshold which we arbitrarily named as 10 to the 26 flops, which technically is a measure of computation, that above that threshold, you had to report to the government that you were doing this. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the rule. Mm-hmm. You to just make sure they were different did it to 25.
Yeah.
But it's all kind of close enough. I think all of these distinctions go away because the technology will now, the technical term is called federated training, where basically you can take pieces and union them together. Mm-hmm. So we may not be able to keep people safe from these new threats.
Well, rumors are that's how OpenAI has had to train, partly because of the power consumption. There's no one place where they did. Well, let's talk about a real war that's going on. I know that something you've been very involved in is the Ukraine war, and in particular, I don't know how much you can talk about White Stork and your goal of having $500 drones, $5 million tanks. So how's that changing warfare?
So I worked for the Secretary for 7 years and tried to change the way we run our military. I'm not a particularly big fan of the military, but it's very expensive, and I wanted to see if I could be helpful. And I think, in my view, I largely failed. They gave me a medal. So they must give medals to failure or, whatever. But my self-criticism was nothing has really changed. And the system in America is not going to lead to real innovation. So watching the Russians use tanks to destroy apartment buildings with little old ladies and kids just drove me crazy. I decided to work on a company with your friend, Sebastian Thrun, and as a former faculty member here, and a whole bunch of Stanford people. And the idea basically is to do two things. Use AI in complicated, powerful ways for these essentially robotic war. And the second one is to lower the cost of the robots. Now you sit there and you go, why would a good liberal like me do that? And the answer is that the whole theory of armies is tanks, artillery, and mortar, and we can eliminate all of them. And we can make the penalty for invading a country, at least by land, essentially be impossible. It should eliminate the kind of land battles.
Well, this is a really interesting question. Is that does it give more advantage to defense versus offense? Can you even make that distinction?
Because I've been doing it the last year, I've learned a lot about war that I really did not want to know. And one of the things to know about war is that the offense always has the advantage because you can always overwhelm the defensive systems. And so you're better off as a strategy of national defense to have a very strong offense that you can use if you need to. And the systems that I and others are building will do that. Because of the way the system works, I am now a licensed arms dealer. So computer scientist, businessman, arms dealer. And I'm sorry to say.
Is that a progression?
I don't know. I do not recommend this in your career path. I'd stick with AI. And because of the way the laws work, we're doing this privately, and then this is all legal with the support of the governments. It goes straight into the Ukraine, and then they fight the war. And without going into all the details, things are pretty bad. I think if in May or June, if the Russians build up as they are expected to, Ukraine will lose a whole chunk of its territory and will begin the process of losing the whole country. So the situation is quite dire. And if anyone knows Marjorie Taylor Greene, I would encourage you to delete her from your contact list because she's the one, a single individual is blocking the provision of some number of billions of dollars to save an important democracy.
I want to switch to a little bit of a philosophical question. So there was an article that you and Henry Kissinger and Dan Huttenlocher wrote last year about the nature of knowledge and how it's evolving. I had a discussion the other night about this as well. So for most of history, humans sort of had a mystical understanding of the universe, and then there's the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And in your article, you argue that now these models are becoming so complicated and difficult to understand that we don't really know what's going on in them. I'll take a quote from Richard Feynman. He says, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." I saw this quote the other day. But now people are creating things that they can create, but they don't really understand what's inside of them. Is the nature of knowledge changing in a way? Are we going to have to start just taking the word for these models without them being able to explain it to us?
The analogy I offer is to teenagers. If you have a teenager, you know they're human, but you can't quite figure out what they're thinking. But somehow we've managed in society to adapt to the presence of teenagers, right? And they eventually grow out of it. And I'm just serious. So it's probably the case that we're going to have knowledge systems that we cannot fully characterize, but we understand their boundaries, right? We understand the limits of what they can do. And that's probably the best outcome we can get.
Do you think we'll understand the limits?
We'll get pretty good at it. The consensus of my group that meets on every week is that eventually the way you'll do this, it's called so-called adversarial AI, is that there will actually be companies that you will hire and pay to break your AI system.
Like red team.
So it'll be instead of human red teams, which is what they do today, you'll have whole companies and a whole industry of AI systems whose jobs are to break the existing AI systems and find their vulnerabilities, especially the knowledge that they have that we can't figure out. That makes sense to me. It's also a great project for you here at Stanford, because if you have a graduate student who has to figure out how to attack one of these large models and understand what it does, that is a great skill to build the next generation. So it makes sense to me that the two will travel together.
All right, let's take some questions from the student. There's one right there in the back. Just say your name.
Earlier you mentioned, and this is related to the comment right now, getting AI that actually does what you want. You just mentioned adversarial AI, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that more. So this seems to be, besides, obviously compute will increase and people get more performant models, but is getting them to do what you want issue?
Well, you have to assume that the current hallucination problems become less, right, as the technology gets better and so forth. I'm not suggesting it goes away. And then you also have to assume that there are tests for efficacy. So there has to be a way of knowing that the thing succeeded. So in the example that I gave of the TikTok competitor, and by the way, I was not arguing that you should illegally steal everybody's music. What you would do if you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, which hopefully all of you will be, is if it took off, then you'd hire a whole bunch of lawyers to go clean the mess up, right? But if nobody uses your product, it doesn't matter that you stole all the content. And do not quote me. Right.
You're on camera.
Yeah, that's right. But you see my point. In other words, Silicon Valley will run these tests and clean up the mess. And that's typically how those things are done. So my own view is that you'll see more and more performative systems with even better tests and eventually adversarial tests, and that'll keep it within a box. The technical term is called chain of thought reasoning, and people believe that in the next few years, you'll be able to generate 1,000 steps of chain of thought reasoning, right? Do this, do this. It's like building recipes, right? That the recipes, run the recipe, and you can actually test that it produced the correct outcome. And that's how the system will work. Yes, sir?
In general, you seem super positive about the potential for AI's progress. And I'm curious, what do you think is going to drive that? Is it just more compute? Is it more data? Is it fundamental architectural shifts?
Yes. To everything. The amounts of money being thrown around are mind-boggling. And I essentially invest in everything because I can't figure out who's going in. And the amounts of money that are following me are so large. I think some of it is because the early money's been made and the big money people who don't know what they're doing have to have an AI component. And everything is now an AI investment, so they can't tell the difference. I define AI as learning systems that actually learn. So I think that's one of them. The second is that there are very sophisticated new algorithms that are sort of post-transformers. My friend, my collaborator for a long time, has invented a new non-transformer architecture. There's a group that I'm funding in Paris that has claims to have done the same thing. So there's enormous invention there, a lot of things at Stanford. The final thing is that there is a belief in the market that the invention of intelligence has infinite return. So let's say you put $50 billion of capital into a company. You have to make an awful lot of money from intelligence to pay that back. So it's probably the case that we'll go through some huge investment bubble, and then it'll sort itself out. That's always been true in the past, and it's likely to be true here.
And what you said earlier was you think that the leaders are pulling away from the rest.
Right now. And this is a really, question is following. There's a company called Mistral in France. They've done a really good job. And I'm obviously an investor. They have produced their second version. Their model is likely to be closed because it's so expensive. They need revenue and they can't give their model away. So this open source versus closed source debate in our industry is huge. And my entire career was based on people being willing to share software in open source. Everything about me is open source. Much of Google's underpinnings were open source. Everything I've done technically. And yet it may be that the capital costs, which are so immense, fundamentally changes how software is built. You and I were talking, my own view of software programmers is that software programmers' productivity will at least double. There are 3 or 4 software companies that are trying to do that. I've invested in all of them in the spirit. And they're all trying to make software programmers more productive. The most interesting one that I just met with is called Augment. And I always think of an individual programmer, and they said, that's not our target. Our target are these 100-person software programming teams on millions of lines of code where nobody knows what's going on. Well, that's a really good AI thing. Will they make money? I hope so.
A lot of questions here.
At the very beginning, you mentioned that there's the combination of the context window expansion, the agents, and the text to action is going to have unimaginable impacts. First of all, why is the combination important? And second of all, I know that you're not like a crystal ball and you can't necessarily tell the future, but why do you think it's beyond anything that we could imagine?
I think largely because the context window allows you to solve the problem of recency. The current models take a year to train, roughly 18 months, 6 months of preparation, 6 months of training, 6 months of fine tuning. So they're always out of date. Context window, you can feed what happened. Like you can ask it questions about the Hamas-Israel war, right, in a context. That's very powerful. It becomes current like Google. In the case of agents, I'll give you an example. I set up a foundation, which is funding a nonprofit, which starts, I don't know if there's chemists in the room, I don't really understand chemistry. There's a tool called ChemCrow, which was an LLM-based system that learned chemistry. And what they do is they run it to generate chemistry hypotheses about proteins, and then they have a lab which runs the tests overnight, and then it learns. That's a huge accelerant in chemistry, material science, and so forth. So that's an agent model. And I think the text to action can be understood by just having a lot of cheap programmers, right? And I don't think we understand what happens, and this is, again, your area of expertise, what happens when everyone has their own programmer? And I'm not talking about turning on and off the lights. I imagine, another example, for some reason you don't like Google. So you say, build me a Google competitor. Yeah, you personally, you don't build me a Google competitor, search the web, build a UI, make a good copy, add generative AI in an interesting way, do it in 30 seconds, and see if it works, right? So a lot of people believe that the incumbents, including Google, are vulnerable to this kind of an attack. Now, we'll see.
There were a bunch of questions who were sent over by Slido. I want to give, some of them were upvoted. So here's one. We talked a little bit about this last year. How can we stop AI from influencing public opinion, misinformation, especially during the upcoming election? What are the short and long-term solutions from?
Most of the misinformation in this upcoming election and globally will be on social media. And the social media companies are not organized well enough to police it. If you look at TikTok, for example, there are lots of accusations that TikTok is favoring one kind of misinformation over another. And there are many people who claim without proof that I'm aware of that the Chinese are forcing them to do it. I think we have a mess here. And the country's going to have to, that may be an impossible challenge for the US. But the fact that somebody told you something does not mean that it's true.
But could it go too far the other way, that there's things that really are true and nobody believes anymore? You get, some people call it epistemological crisis, that now, Elon says, no, I never did that. Prove it.
Well, let's use Donald Trump.
Okay.
Look, I think we have a trust problem in our society that can fail. I think that the greatest threat to democracy is misinformation, because we're going to get really good at it. When I managed YouTube, the biggest problems we had on YouTube were that people would upload false videos and people would die as a result. And we had a no-death policy. Shocking. And we just went, it was just horrendous to try to address this. Yeah. And this is before... I don't have a good answer.
One technical is not an answer, but one thing that seems like it could mitigate that, I don't understand why it's more widely used, is public key authentication. That when Joe Biden speaks, why isn't it digitally signed like SSL is? Or, that celebrities or public figures or others, couldn't they have?
It's a form of public key, and then some form of knowing how the system.
When I send my credit card to Amazon, I know it's Amazon.
So I wrote a paper and published it with Jonathan Haidt, who's the one working on the anxiety generation stuff. It had exactly the impact. And he's a very good communicator. I probably am not. So my conclusion was that the system is not organized to do what you said.
You had a paper advocating what we did, that
advocating
approach?
your proposal.
Okay, my proposal. Yeah.
No, what you said.
Yeah, right.
And my conclusion is the CEOs in general are maximizing revenue. To maximize revenue, you maximize engagement. To maximize engagement, you maximize algorithms choose outrage because that's more revenue, right? Therefore, there's a bias to favor crazy stuff. And on all sides. I'm not making a partisan statement here. That's a problem. That's got to get addressed. In a democracy, and my solution to TikTok, we talked about this earlier privately, is when I was a boy, there was something called the equal time rule. Because TikTok is really not social media, it's really television, right? There's a programmer making you, the numbers, by the way, are 90 minutes a day, 200 TikTok videos per TikTok user in the United States. It's a lot, right? And the government is not going to do the equal time rule, but it's the right thing to do. Some form of balance that is required.
All right, let's take some more questions.
Two quick questions. One, economic impact of LLMs, slower, like labor market impacts, slower than you originally anticipated, and Chegg and customer service people. And then two, do you think academia deserves or should get subsidies? Or do you think they should just partner with big players out there?
I pushed really, really hard on getting data centers for universities. If I were a faculty member in the computer science department here, I would be beyond upset. I can't build the algorithms with my graduate students that will do the kind of PhD research. And then I'm forced to work with these. And the companies have not, in my view, been generous enough with respect to that. The faculty members that I talk with, many of whom you know, spend lots of time waiting for their credits from Google Cloud, and then that's terrible. This is an explosion. We want America to win. We want universities, America, there's lots of reasons to think that the right thing to do is to get it to them. So I'm working hard on that. And your first question was labor market impact. I'll defer to the real expert here. As your amateur economist taught by Eric, I fundamentally believe that the sort of college education, high skills task will be fine because people will work with these systems. I think the systems is no different from any other technology wave. The dangerous jobs and the jobs which require very little human judgment will get replaced.
We have about 5 minutes left, so let's go really quick with some questions. I'll let you pick them, Eric.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm really curious about the text to action and its impact on, for example, computer science education. I'm wondering what you have thoughts on like how CS education should transform to kind of meet the age.
Well, I'm assuming that computer scientists as a group in undergraduate school will always have a programmer buddy with them. So when you learn your first for loop and so forth and so on, you'll have a tool that will be your natural partner. And that's how the teaching will go on. That the professor, he or she will talk about the concepts, but you'll engage with it that way. And that's my guess. Yes, ma'am, behind you.
I think one that's been talked about is like state models, but then now with longer context.
I don't understand the math well enough. I'm really pleased that we have produced jobs for mathematicians because the math is so complicated. But basically, they are different ways of doing gradient descent, matrix multiply, faster and better. And transformers, as you know, is a sort of systematic way of multiplying at the same time. I think about it, and it's similar to that, but different math. Let's see, over here, yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, you.
You mentioned in your paper on national security that you have China and the US, and that next cluster down are all either U.S. allies or teed up nicely to the U.S. allies. Curious what your take is on those 10 that are sort of in like the middle that aren't formally allies. What is stuff? How likely are they to get on board with securing our superiority line, and what would hold them back from wanting to?
Most interesting country is India, because the top AI people come from India to the US. And we should let India keep some of its top talent. Not all of them, but some of them. And they don't have the kind of training facilities and programs that we so richly have here. To me, India is the big swing state in that regard. China's lost. It's not going to come back. They're not going to change the regime as much as we wish them to do. Japan and Korea are clearly in our camp. Taiwan is a fantastic country whose software is terrible. So that's not going to work. Amazing hardware. And in the rest of the world, there are not a lot of other good choices that are big. Europe is screwed up because of Brussels. It's not a new fact. I spent 10 years fighting them. And I worked really hard to get them to fix the EU Act. And they still have all the restrictions that make it difficult to do our kind of research in Europe. My French friends have spent all their time battling Brussels, and Macron, who's a personal friend, is fighting hard for this. And so France, I think, has a chance. I don't see Germany coming, and the rest is not big enough. Yes, ma'am?
So I know you're an engineer by training, like you call it compiler. Given the capabilities that you envision these models having, should we still spend time learning to code?
Yeah, because ultimately it's the old thing of why do you study English? You can speak English, you get better at it, right? You really do need to understand how these systems work, and I feel very strongly. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'm curious if you've explored the distributed setting, and I'm asking because, sure, making a large cluster is difficult, but MacBooks are powerful. There's a lot of small machines across the world. Like, do you think like folding at home or a similar idea works for training AI systems?
Yeah, we've looked very hard at this. So the way the algorithms work is you have a very large matrix, and you have essentially a multiplication function. So think of it as going back and forth and back and forth. And these systems are completely limited by the speed of memory to CPU or GPU. And in fact, the next iteration of Nvidia chips has combined all those functions into one chip. The chips are now so big that they glue them all together. And in fact, the package is so sensitive that the package is put together in a clean room as well as the chip itself. So the answer looks like supercomputers and speed of light, especially memory interconnect, really dominated. So I think unlikely for a while.
Is there a way to segment the LLM? Like, so Jeff Dean last year when he spoke here talked about having these different parts of it that you would train separately and then kind of federate them.
In order to do that, you'd have to have 10 million such things, and then the way you would ask the questions would be too slow. He's talking about 8 or 10 or 12.
Yeah. So not down to the level of
not at his level.
Yeah.
Let's see this way back.
I know, like after ChatGPT was released, the New York Times sued OpenAI for using their works for training. Where do you think that's going to go? And what that means?
I used to do a lot of work on the music licensing stuff. And what I learned was that in the 60s, there was a series of lawsuits that resulted in an agreement where you get a stipulated royalty whenever your song is played. Even they don't even know who you are. It's just paid into a bank. And my guess is the same thing. There'll be lots of lawsuits and there'll be some kind of stipulated agreement, which will just say you have to pay X% of whatever revenue you have in order to use that.
ASCAP, EMI.
ASCAP, EMI. Look them up. It will seem very old to you, but I think that's how it will ultimately. Yes, sir.
There's a few players that are dominating AI, right, and they'll continue to dominate, and they seem to overlap with the large companies that all the antitrust regulation is kind of focused on. How do you see those two trends kind of, do you see regulators breaking up these companies, and how will that affect
So in my career, I helped Microsoft get broken up, and it wasn't broken up, and I fought for Google to not be broken up, and it's not been broken up. So it sure looks to me like the trend is not to be broken up. As long as the companies avoid being John D. Rockefeller the senior, and I studied this, look it up, it's how antitrust law came. I don't think the governments will act. The reason you're seeing these large companies dominate is who has the capital to build these data centers, right? Right. So my friend Reed and my friend Mustafa.
He's coming next week. Reed, 2 weeks from now.
Have Reed talk to you about the decision that they made to take Inflection and essentially piece part it into Microsoft. Basically, they decided they couldn't raise the tens of billions of dollars.
Is that number public that you mentioned earlier?
No.
Okay.
Have Reed give you.
Maybe Reed can say it. I know you got to go. I don't want to hold you. I want to leave with.
Should we want this gentleman?
I also have a question for you.
One more.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering where all of this is going to leave countries who are non-participants in development of frontier models and access to compute, for example.
The rich get richer, and the poor do the best they can. They'll have to. The fact of the matter is, this is a rich country's game, right? Huge capital, lots of technically strong people, strong government support, right? There are 2 examples. There are lots of other countries that have all sorts of problems. They don't have those resources. They'll have to find a partner. They'll have to join with somebody else, something like that.
I want to leave it because I think the last time we met you, you were at a hackathon at AGI House, and I know you spent a lot of time helping like young people as they create a lot of wealth, and you spoke very passionately about wanting to do that. Do you have any advice for folks here as they're writing their business plans for this class, or policy proposals or research proposals at this stage of the careers going forward? Well,
I teach a class in the business school on this, so you should come to my class. I am struck by the speed with which you can build demonstrations of new ideas. So in one of the hackathons I did, the winning team, the command was fly the drone between 2 towers, and it was given a virtual drone space. And it figured out how to fly the drone, what the word between meant, generated the code in Python, and flew the drone in the simulator through the tower. It would have taken a week or 2 from good professional programmers to do that. I'm telling you that the ability to prototype quickly, really, part of the problem with being an entrepreneur is everything happens faster. Well, now, if you get your prototype built in a day using these various tools, you need to think about that, right? Because that's who your competitor is doing. So I guess my biggest advice is when you start thinking about a company, it's fine to write a business plan. In fact, you should ask the computer to write your business plan for you, as long as it's legal.
I should talk about that after you leave.
But I think it's very important to prototype your idea using these you can, because you can be sure there's another person doing exactly that same thing in another company.